Greetings, beautiful people. Welcome to Video Chat 7. Today we're going to talk about Metzgar chapters 3 and 4. In this chapter, he talks about the issues that were at stake in the strike of 1959. And in his prologue, which you definitely should read, you don't have to do a summary of the prologue, but you should read it because what he does is contextualize the strike of 59 in terms of the larger things that were at stake in this strike. He points out that in 1959, corporate management in several different industries was involved in what he calls a counteroffensive against the gains that workers had made since the 1930s. So basically, it's an attempt to roll back the New Deal. And the strike of 59, he argues, was significant because had workers lost that strike, the rollback of the New Deal might have taken place 20 years earlier than it did. It might have taken place in 1960 instead of the 1980s. So the stakes were really high. When we look at chapter 3, to be or not to be, he delves into the section of the contract, section 2B, which was a major issue in the strike of 59. You may remember that this was something that management wanted to get rid of and the workers wanted to maintain because they felt that 2B was the part of the workers' workplace rule of law that prohibited management from being arbitrary and having complete power over the workers. It gave workers some control, not total control, but some control over the work routine and basically the staffing levels on the steel mill floor. So let's look at section 2B. He actually excerpts the section 2B on pages 101 and 102. And I'd like to take a moment and actually read that section together because it's kind of legalese and it's a little bit hard to understand when you read it. But let's look at a couple of key sections of section 2B, specifically paragraphs 3 and 4, which are listed on page 102. So if you'd find page 102 in your Metzgar book, let's read it together. Section 3, or I should say paragraph 3 of section 2B says, quote, should there be any local working conditions in effect which provide benefits that are in excess of or in addition to the benefits established by this agreement, they shall remain in effect for the term of this agreement, except as they are changed or eliminated by mutual agreement or in accordance with paragraph 4 below. So it basically says that if you're in a steel mill that has some practices that are better than this agreement, you can keep them unless both sides agree to eliminate them. Okay? Now, let's look at paragraph 4, right below that. Quote, the company shall have the right to change or eliminate any local working conditions if, as the result of action taken by management under section 3, which we just read, management, the basis for the existence of the local working conditions is changed or eliminated, thereby making it unnecessary to continue such local working conditions. Provided, however, that when such a change or elimination is made by the company, any affected employee shall have recourse to the grievance procedure and arbitration if necessary to have the company justify its action. Okay, so what does all this legalistic language mean? Well, one of the things it means is if the working conditions change, like if management finds a more efficient way of producing steel. Like if they come up with a more efficient blast furnace or a more efficient rolling mill that requires fewer people to make the same amount of steel, management can change the staffing levels. But it can't just go in to an existing rolling mill and say, hey, you 20 guys, we're going to eliminate half of you just because we think the rest of you can work twice as hard. They can't do that. If, however, they come up with a new rolling mill that only requires half as many people, then management has the right to eliminate half of those jobs. However, paragraph 4 says the workers have the right to appeal and to grieve it or go to arbitration, and the company has to justify that action. Okay? So I think this is very important. Even though it's kind of digging down into the weeds of a very complicated section of the contract, one of the criticisms of unions is, oh, well, they didn't let management be efficient. They kept it inefficient. They kept business inefficient. That's really not what's happening here. It says that management, if it finds a more efficient way of doing things, can eliminate jobs, but they have to be able to justify it. And workers have a due process whereby they can challenge that. And any changes other than that have to be negotiated between management and the workers. All it does is gives workers an equal voice in the shop floor, the shop floor staffing levels. So the idea that workers had all the power or workers had control over this is simply not true according to the way Section 2B is worded. I think it's also significant that in Chapter 2, we saw that as a result of the strike, there was a commission to study, apparently the companies complained that the union was blocking efforts at making production more efficient. And so as a result, they kept 2B because workers won the strike, so 2B is in there, but they established a commission, and the commission was sent out to study, okay, let's find some examples of actually where management thinks less staffing could be used, and they believe that 2B is blocking that. And as he points out in Chapter 2, they couldn't find any examples. Okay, so I think this is very interesting because one of the knocks on unions that you often hear is that, they make business less efficient and they don't let management manage. And this, when you look deeper at it, it's simply not the case. In fact, most contracts, like 2B, have to be negotiated by both sides. It has to be agreed on by both sides. So if you're knocking unions, then you also have to knock management because management was halfway responsible for 2B. They helped write it. They agreed to it. Okay, and then they wanted to get rid of it because it didn't let them do whatever they wanted. Well, that's true. They couldn't do whatever they wanted. They had to negotiate with the workers. And that's the key. I think that's the really important thing that he talks about in Chapter 3, is that any changes had to be negotiated with the workers. And I think that is a key part of what he's trying to argue in this book, is that unions themselves didn't take over business. But what they did is they gave workers a voice. Okay? And he has a very interesting quote on page 106 that I'd like to read to you. Okay? He's talking about, contrast what the unionized workplace looks like with a non-union workplace. Quote, Think of a non-union workplace today, a place full of white-collar professionals, managers, and clerical workers, a clean, well-lighted place with air conditioning and genteel manners. It's probably been downsized, right-sized, restructured, and re-engineered. Its surviving workforce is terrorized. Its workers have no protection from even the grandest and stupidest recommendations from management, who are free to decide which members of the corporate family are no longer necessary. These workers can be moved around and redefined like pieces in a chess game whose rules have been forgotten. Please report to Human Resources, they are asked, where you will be stripped of your dignity, your identity, and your livelihood. Such things could not happen in a steel mill in the 1950s. Other things could. It was still dirty, noisy, and dangerous, freezing in winter and boiling in summer, and the work was still unpleasant and difficult. But you were nobody's pawn to be moved about in endless combinations in pursuit of efficiency. If management wanted efficiency, if it wanted increased productivity and profits, it would have to come to you or your representatives and talk about it, negotiate it, bargain it. And it had better come with some incentives in its pocket. It had better bargain in good faith. It had better be reasonable if it wanted you to be reasonable. So what I think unions, even at their most powerful, didn't mean that it wasn't capitalism anymore. It didn't mean that the workers controlled everything. It simply meant that management didn't control everything either, that changes in the workplace had to be negotiated between both sides. I was reminded of this when I was having a discussion with my sister-in-law, who is a professional, works at Fidelity Investments, is definitely white collar and Republican. And I remember her telling a story about her department. Her department head called everybody into the office one day and said there were about 20 people in that department. And the head of the department said, okay, in a month, half of you are going to be out of a job. And I don't know which half it's going to be. So let's find out who the team players are. Everybody was terrorized. Everybody felt that they were walking on eggshells. And if you were asked to come in on the weekend, do you think you dared say no? Do you think you dared ask if you could go pick up your kid from childcare or go take your kid to a soccer game because you couldn't work late that day? No, you were terrorized and you had no voice in it. And when I was telling her about my labor history class, she surprised me when she said, yeah, I kind of wish we had a union. So, it's interesting that unions seem like they're big bureaucratic institutions until you're in one of those situations where you really don't have a lot of power. I've also been seeing this among workers during the coronavirus. I was reading an article just yesterday about workers at a Domino's Pizza in LA who are terrified because their coworkers, a number of their coworkers, have come down with the coronavirus and they're sick. And their management won't give them any paid sick leave or won't give them any protective equipment. And so they're going on strike. They're non-union, but they're going on strike. They walked out. And I think whether you're high or low on the workplace totem pole, having a voice over your working conditions is a basic human right. And I think this is really what 2B is all about. All right, so let's look at chapter 4, which is called When the Wolf Came to the Door. Chapter 4 is also extremely important in this book because it deals with the question of whether the union's victory in 1959 killed the steel industry. and specifically whether what he calls overmanning killed the steel industry. And by this he means, did the steel industry have to maintain too many workers because of Section 2B? And because they maintained so many workers, it made them less profitable, and that's why the steel industry declined by the 1970s. Okay, so it's a crucial chapter and a crucial part of his argument. Two things I want to bring to your attention. There are two tables in chapter 4 that I want you to look at. The first table is on page 121, and it is a table that charts the employment levels and the productivity in the steel industry over the years from 1940 to 1984. Okay, by which time the American steel industry was in decline, was suffering from foreign competition, and was busy closing down a number of steel mills in the United States. If you look at that table on page 121, it's a bewildering array of numbers, but I want to draw your attention specifically to two columns on that table. One is the third column over from the left, wage workers as a percent of total. And the other is the far right column, which is the annual tons of steel shipped per wage worker. So this is a measure of productivity, okay, per worker. Now, if we look at that wage workers as a percent of total, note what happens between 1940 and 1984. Just let your eye go down that column, and what you see is that the percent of wage workers as a percent of total goes down, which means that in terms of the company's payroll, far more workers were white collar by 1984 than they were in 1940. The percentage of wage earners, that is hourly workers, that's shop floor workers, these are the steel workers on the floor, these are the ones covered by 2B, they've actually gone down from 89% of the total to 72% of the total by 1984. Pretty significant drop. Well, what happened to productivity per worker, not overall, per worker during that time? The annual tons of steel shipped per worker went from 101 tons in 1940. Now let your eye go down that column on the right-hand side to 1984, when 433 tons per worker are being produced. Okay, let's think about this for a minute. So the workers as a percentage of the whole are going down, and yet their productivity is increasing. Some of this probably had to do with new technology. Well, if 2B was to blame for the downfall of the industry, you would probably see that there wouldn't be very much of a change in either of those columns. And yet, I don't think the data suggests that workers are completely to blame for the downfall of the steel industry. There had to be other factors. American workers were more productive in the 1980s than they were in the 1940s, and they were a smaller percentage of the steel industry workforce. So blaming unions and blaming 2B for the downfall of steel, I think he's going to argue is a stretch here. Now let's look at the other table 2 pages later on page 123. And that is the international comparisons of steel productivity. Okay, this is hours worked per net ton at actual operating rates. Okay, so the smaller the number of hours the more per ton, the more productive each worker is. And it compares the United States, Japan, West Germany. Okay, so this is Cold War era, right? But West Germany was the western half of Germany, which was in the capitalist west of Europe, France, and United Kingdom. And by 1982, the United States had the most productive steel industry per worker of any of them. It took the fewest number of hours to produce a ton of steel of any of their competitors. Okay, so let's think about this too. If it's the union's fault for making steel less productive, why is it that the United States steel worker was the most productive by the 1980s and was the most productive throughout the period covered on that table? All right, so thinking about the data, I think it gives lie to the claim that unions are to blame for the downfall of American industry. And this is really the theme that he deals with in chapter 4. So I want you to pay attention to his argument, and what he says is an explanation for why unions got blamed, perhaps unfairly, for the downfall of the American steel industry. So taken together, chapters 3 and 4 really form a core part of the book. All right. Again, as with all of our readings, please, after you watch the video, read the chapters, write your summaries, and then take part of your summary, either one of your examples or your reflection. Go ahead and post that on the discussion board for either chapter 3 or 4, depending on which one you read. And take a moment also to skim and look at the selections from the chapter that you didn't read, so you get a sense of both chapters. All right, we'll see you next time.